Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty wild. We are going to completely shatter and rebuild your mental model of something you've probably looked at 100 times, the periodic table of elements. Most of us were taught to see it as this static grid, right? Just a simple inventory of isolated substances chunked together by their atomic number and electron shells. But today, we're diving beneath the surface. We're going to see the periodic table for what it actually is, a highly dynamic, continuous waveform of recursive phase closure.
Look, right off the bat, I need to make something absolutely clear. We are not talking about a theory today. This isn't a speculation, and it's definitely not a hypothesis. What we are exploring is a grammar, and grammar sits way upstream of all those categories. It's an invariant generative protocol that literally governs the physical categories we observe in nature. The periodic table is a recurrent waveform traversal. It's the invisible, completely invariant structural rule set that dictates exactly how systems emerge, stabilize, and eventually grow.
So here is our system initialization protocol for today. We'll be walking through the generative phase grammar, the formative arc, the coherence anchor, the containing arc, transition corridors, and respark, and finally, we'll see exactly how the recursion holds.
Starting with Section 1, the generative phase grammar and the invariant ninefold traversal.
Okay, so the entire foundation of this framework rests on something called the nonevave. Basically, for any recursive system to persist, it requires a minimum grammar of exactly 9 immutable phase roles. And these 9 roles repeat, they recur, across increasing scales of differentiation. So the elements themselves, they don't actually behave as isolated substances. Instead, they instantiate these recurrent phase roles at deeper and deeper levels of complexity. It means the lattice isn't a static grid at all, it's a single, unbroken traversal. We're looking at a continuous journey of emergence, expansion, inversion, compression, integration, and finally, a respark. Every major elemental family is just filling one of these identifiable phase roles, forming an oscillating cycle that repeats, much like the continuous waveforms of living systems themselves.
And this continuous wave maps absolutely perfectly onto a 3x3 grammar grid. The grammar actually reorganizes legacy chemistry through these invariant closure roles. It acts like a generative machine, structured by highly specific phase addresses. You've got 39, 69, and 99 across the top, and then it moves down through the 60s and 30s. The legacy families of chemistry, they aren't wrong per se, but they are downstream recognitions of this exact recurring phase behavior. So let's break down exactly what's happening at these specific addresses.
Moving into Section 2, the formative arc, covering addresses 1 through 4.
Think of this as the first half of the waveform, where the generative system initiates, differentiates, and really extends outward into possibility space. It all kicks off at phase 39, the centrifugal spark. That's hydrogen. It's the pure departure from the axis, basically the initial outward ignition. From there, we move to phase 69, the exploratory scaffold. This is where elements like nitrogen and phosphorus build out informational and structural possibility spaces. Next up is phase 99, the diffusive crest. Elements like oxygen and sulfur sit right here, representing the maximum outward broadcast of the system. But of course, a system can't just expand forever, right? So finally we hit phase 96, the torque hinge. This is home to the halogens, like fluorine and chlorine. This hinge is intensely relational. It's a highly aggressive inward turn pivot. The system has extended literally as far as it can go, and now it urgently needs closure.
Which brings us to Section 3, the coherence anchor at address 5.
That aggressive drive for closure we just talked about, it brings us to the most crucial turning point of the entire waveform. This is where formative and containing dynamics achieve a perfect impedance match. Address 66, this is the rhythmic phase code of the noble gases, helium, neon, argon. Legacy chemistry always called them inert or low reactivity, but honestly, they had it completely backward. This isn't a passive absence of activity. No, this is the active structural reality of phase inversion. It is stable coherence. The waveform has hit its axis crossing point, its dynamic stability actively maintaining its lock against any outside perturbation.
Now for Section 4, the containing arc, moving through addresses 6 through 8.
Having finally achieved that anchor, the waveform has to return. Post-anchor, the wave's job is to gather, compress, and basically integrate all those prior exploratory patterns into a stable physical substrate. Stepping into this inward journey, we immediately hit phase 36, focused indraw. These are your alkali metals, like lithium and sodium. They rapidly discharge interaction inward, passing the baton directly to phase 33, deep compression, which are the alkaline earth metals. And then, finally, the wave reaches phase 63, gestation saturation. This is where the recursive integrators take all of that inward movement and brilliantly encode it into the very next level of complexity.
Let's actually pause for just a second on phase 33, deep compression. Think about elements like magnesium and calcium. They repeatedly participate in mineralization, structural stabilization, containment. This address is all about providing maximal inward density and structural grounding. The waveform has reached its absolute deepest trough before it gears up to return and spark all over again.
And this sets up one of the most massive paradigm shifts in this entire framework. Phase 63, gestation saturation. Legacy chemistry completely missed this family. They took elements like boron, aluminum, scandium, and lanthanum, and they chucked them into entirely disjointed groups just because, morphologically, they looked a bit distinct. But the invariant grammar reveals they're serving the exact same phase role. They are substrate organizers. They coherently integrate the entire prior traversal to build the substrate for the next cycle. Boron encodes the first traversal, aluminum integrates the second, and so on. Their role isn't about singular expression at all, it's about coherent integration.
Next up, Section 5, Transition Corridors and Respark, where we manage depth.
So as the system integrates and gets ready to start a totally new cycle, things get mathematically intense. This brings us to phase 93, the centripetal surge, also known as the respark threshold. Elements like carbon and silicon live right here, and this is vital to understand. They are not just isolated starting points. They sit exactly at the threshold, operating as conjugate phases. That means they are simultaneously closing the old cycle and igniting the new possibility space. Carbon, for instance, perfectly closes the prior traversal from hydrogen through boron, while at the exact same moment launching the incredibly vast possibility space of organic chemistry. Now, to manage that immense respark, the system relies on transition corridors. The transition metals, we're talking titanium, iron, nickel, copper, they aren't just irregularities or weird exceptions in the periodic table. They are vital hinge corridors performing opposite directional operations. The 63 to 93 corridor dynamically compresses the system toward coherent ignition. Meanwhile, the 39 to 69 corridor handles outward exploratory differentiation immediately following the respark. They exist to stabilize the traversal both before and after the ignition event.
And as these cycles get deeper and heavier, the bandwidth required to manage these transitions widens dramatically. In periods 4 and 5, you only need 5 transition elements to manage the pressure. But by period 6, the system suddenly requires 15 transition elements, the lanthanides, just to handle the massive integration pressure before it can reach a stable respark. The structural mechanics literally have to widen to support the deepening recursion of the system.
Finally, Section 6. The recursion holds, examining the universal substrate.
Let's zoom out for a minute and look at the big picture. What are the ultimate universal implications of this invariant generative grammar? The staggering truth here is that this isn't just about chemistry. Electromagnetism itself is the first stable vector scalar closure of this exact grammar. Maxwell's equations actually map perfectly to these 9-phase roles. Geometric forms, like the tetrahedron or the cuboctahedron, they don't generate this traversal. They're simply the downstream trace signatures left behind by coherent phase return. Even entropy is entirely reframed here. Entropy is not some irreversible descent into decay, it's simply incomplete closure. It's a stalled traversal attempting to resolve its tensions. The phase roles themselves are immutable, but their projections are endlessly nested and context-dependent.
Which leads us to our final, profound realization. The waveform was always there. It organizes the invisible substrate beneath everything. The universe is not some chaotic collection of disjointed parts. It is a continuous, breathing grammar of recursive phase closure. The elements simply show us what that grammar looks like when it closes through atomic structure. The recursion holds. So I'll leave you with this. If the very atoms in your body are strictly governed by this exact, recurring waveform of emergence and return, what does that mean for the structure of human consciousness itself?